For more than 24 hours after landing at an international airport in the Polish capital of Warsaw, a media contingent, including Newzroom Afrika's journalists and President Cyril Ramaphosa, is about 120 special forces, high-ranking security personnel and journalists were unable to disembark and head to Rzeszów when Polish officials refused entry of presidential protection unit weapons into their country. This comes after South Africa failed to comply with standard entry procedures. Now the Polish authorities have finally allowed them to leave the airport. Let's get some reaction on this from Gabriel Crouse, an analyst from the Institute for Race Relations. So thank you for joining us this evening. Now, do we know what went wrong with regards to the standards that South Africa was supposed to meet in order for the personnel, together with some of that equipment that was supposed to cross those borders? What went wrong?
Some people are 100% confident that they know. I'm not one of them. I think that this is important to understand in the context of a diplomatic mission in the midst of a war, which includes an information war. And so there's a lot of misinformation about and a lot of overconfidence. Right. There are two sides to the story. Wally Rood, who some of us still remember from the Pala Pala scandal, the head of President Ramaphosa's protection unit, he says that everyone had the right documents. Some had originals, some had photocopies, and that this usually is satisfactory. But all of a sudden, the Polish officials said that the photocopied documents are not good enough, and they need originals. The Poles say that the South African delegation, although having had 3 meetings in advance between Durko and the Polish foreign cabinet members, representatives, nevertheless arrived without having done what they were supposed to do. I don't think, actually, that any of the outside public commentators can be 100% confident of which version is true. We know as South Africans that our government officials sometimes err. We also ought to know, I think, that the South African leadership is not welcome in all parts of the West, certainly not amongst all of Ukraine's allies, and few are as staunch as Poland, which considers itself to be, as pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia as it can get. And on the international stage, South Africa is sometimes seen as hostile because of its official non-aligned position. So, there might be reasons for them to try and give gears to the South African peace delegation. My view is we're not going to know, or if we do, it's going to take a bit more time to figure out what really went wrong.
Well, I mean, as you mentioned, Mr. Wally Rood accuses the Polish officials of being racist and blatantly sabotaging South Africa. And we also know, like you've stated, that the United States and Poland are long-time allies and have got very strong bilateral ties. Do you believe that Mr. Rood's accusations could possibly be true, like you say, in South Africa not being accepted so much, especially now with their stance in the West?
I think it would be naive to rule it out. I think it's possible that it's false, but it would be naive to rule it out. Let me give you a bit of context. Last week, the Washington Post, an American newspaper whose editorial line is pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia, pro-West, anti-the rest, nevertheless published an article in which substance was given to allegations that Ukraine had been responsible for blowing up Nord Stream 2, a Russian pipeline going from Russia to Germany. This was the energy question before the war. Really, in some ways, the thing that the war ended up being about was Russia trying to build pipelines to go around Ukraine so that it stopped paying money to a government that it considered hostile, and then the Germans saying, no, we don't want it. The point is that it was blown up. Seymour Hersh, an American award-winning journalist, says on his information the Americans blew it up. The Washington Post says, no, in fact, the Ukrainians blew it up, that members of its own military were involved, that it went all the way to the top of the military. And and that this was known by the Americans in advance, that the information had been shared. But nevertheless, when it took place, for months and months, everyone blamed the Russians. And the Washington Post line that's the most important and pertinent to this conversation is that there's a more or less clear understanding amongst European and American diplomats that one shouldn't just talk about this at all. There should be what the Ukrainians call informational silence around this act of terrorism, which took place affecting Europeans who have nothing to do with the war. Because if you look into it, it looks maybe like Ukraine's military was behind it. Now, that matters because if you look at the volume of energy, the billions of liters, cubic meters of energy that was to be supplied through that route to Germany, to the rest of Europe, providing them with cheap energy to keep jobs going, to keep their economies growing. The thought that their own governments might have seen this coming, the destruction of that infrastructure, destruction of infrastructure unlike anything we've seen in South Africa, either during the struggle or since. To the thought that the government officials in charge of those countries that would be negatively affected by that might see it coming and just say, well, let's look the other way, and then afterwards, let's not talk about it, even if it's harming our own people, because we are on the side of Ukraine, and we don't want to be seen to be criticizing Ukraine, even if they're destroying our infrastructure. I mean, this is the allegation being leveled in the Washington Post, and it's at such a serious level that it makes the thought that the Polish administration might get in the way of the Ramaphosa peace mission with a few hours on the tarmac, it makes that seem almost trivial in comparison. Now, the Washington Post can't be 100% sure that Ukraine's military did blow it up. Maybe it was the Americans, maybe it was someone else. Nor can we be certain that the Poles deliberately tried to sabotage this mission. I'm not at all trying to suggest certainty. What I'm trying to suggest is that in this context of this war and a peace mission to try and end this war, there are different players with their own incentives, and that the incentives don't necessarily line up with the truth or with the public interest in hearing what the truth really is. So, yeah, more question marks than answers, I suppose.
Most certainly. Gabriel, thank you so much for your insights this evening. Certainly one to keep an eye on. That was Gabriel Crouse, an analyst from the Institute for Race Relations, speaking to us there about some of the relationships between Poland and South Africa and what is currently happening.